The letter trembled in Elias's hands, its edges worn from being unfolded and refolded 100 times. He stood frozen on the Seattle sidewalk, the city's pulse thrumming around him, horns blaring, rain hissing against asphalt, voices laughing from a nearby cafe. But all he could hear was the echo of his own heartbeat, pounding like it might break free. It had been 5 years since his parents vanished. No note, no call, just an empty house in Boise, Idaho, where Elias had grown up. He was 17 then, barely out of high school, still reeling from the night he'd told them he was gay. Their silence had been louder than any words. His mother's tight-lipped stare, his father's abrupt exit from the room. The next morning, Elias woke to find their car gone, the house stripped of their belongings, and his life upended. They'd moved states without a word, leaving him behind like a discarded piece of furniture. Now, this letter, postmarked from Georgia, begged him to come home. Elias's breath hitched as he scanned the words again. "We were wrong. We miss you. Please come back to us." His mother's handwriting, once so familiar, now felt like a stranger's. He stuffed the letter into his jacket pocket, his fingers brushing against the worn leather. The rain began to fall harder, soaking his dark hair, but he didn't move. He couldn't. Not yet. Across the street, Theo watched him from under the awning of a record store, his colorful scarf a splash of defiance against the gray city. Theo's warm brown eyes softened with concern. He'd seen that look on Elias's face before, when the past clawed its way back, threatening to unravel the life they'd built together. Theo crossed the street, dodging a cyclist, and stopped beside Elias. "You okay?" he asked, his voice gentle but firm, like he already knew the answer. Elias didn't look up. "They wrote me," he said, the words barely audible over the rain. Theo's jaw tightened, but he didn't push. He never did. That was what Elias loved about him. Theo knew when to wait, when to let the silence speak. But this silence was heavy, pregnant with years of hurt. 5 years ago, Elias had been a kid with nowhere to go. His parents' abandonment left him couch surfing with friends, scraping by on part-time jobs at gas stations and diners. Boise wasn't kind to a queer kid with no family, and the whispers, freak, sinner, lost cause, followed him like shadows. He'd almost given up when he met Theo at a community center art class, a chance encounter that changed everything. Theo, with his easy smile and paint-stained fingers, had been a lifeline, pulling Elias out of the dark with late-night talks and shared dreams of a bigger life. They'd moved to Seattle together 2 years ago, chasing a fresh start. Elias found work as a barista, while Theo sold his illustrations to local galleries. Their apartment was small, cluttered with books and canvases, but it was theirs. They'd built something real, something Elias hadn't thought possible after his parents left him to fend for himself. Yet here was this letter, threatening to drag him back to a past he'd fought to leave behind. "Do you want to talk about it?" Theo asked, brushing a wet strand of hair from Elias's face. His touch was warm, grounding. Elias shook his head, but his eyes betrayed him, glistening with unshed tears. Theo pulled him into a hug, heedless of the rain soaking them both. "Whatever you decide, I'm here," he whispered. Elias leaned into him, the letter burning a hole in his pocket. He didn't know what he'd decide, whether to ignore it, burn it, or face the parents who'd thrown him away. But for now, Theo's arms were enough to keep him steady. The next morning, Elias sat at their kitchen table, the letter spread out before him. The apartment smelled of coffee and fresh paint, a mix of their lives intertwined. Theo was in the next room, sketching, the soft scratch of his pencil a comforting rhythm. Elias traced the words with his finger. "We were wrong." What did that even mean? Were they sorry for leaving? For judging him? Or was this just guilt, a belated attempt to ease their own consciences? He remembered the last night in Boise vividly. His parents had been eating dinner, meatloaf, mashed potatoes, the same meal they'd had every Thursday for years. Elias had rehearsed his words for weeks, his heart pounding as he said, "I'm gay." His mother's fork froze midair. His father stood, chairs scraping the floor, and walked out. The next day, they were gone. Elias had waited weeks for them to come back, sleeping in his childhood bedroom, hoping it was a mistake. It wasn't. Now, they claimed they'd moved to Georgia for a fresh start. The letter mentioned a new church, a new community, and a vague apology for how things were handled. Elias scoffed. Handled? Like he was a problem to be managed, not their son. But the final line haunted him. We want to see you. We're still your family. Theo appeared in the doorway, holding 2 mugs of coffee. He set one in front of Elias and sat across from him, his expression open but guarded. You've been staring at that thing for an hour, he said softly. What's it saying to you? Elias exhaled, running a hand through his hair. I don't know. Part of me wants to crumple it up and forget it. But another part, he trailed off, unable to articulate the pull he felt. Was it hope? Curiosity? Or just the ghost of the kid who'd wanted his parents' love? Theo reached across the table, his hand covering Elias's. You don't owe them anything, he said, his voice steady. But if you need to see them, to get answers to close that door, then do it. Just don't go alone. Elias met his eyes, a flicker of gratitude cutting through the turmoil. Theo was right. He didn't have to face this alone. But the idea of seeing his parents again, of standing in front of the people who'd abandoned him, made his stomach churn. What would he say? What would they say to make it right? By noon, Elias had made a decision. He wouldn't reply. Not yet. But he'd go to Georgia. Not for them, but for himself. To look them in the eyes and ask why. To finally bury the pain, or maybe find a way to heal it. Theo agreed to come, rearranging his gallery schedule without hesitation. They booked flights for the following week, the cheapest ones they could find, and began planning a trip that felt more like a pilgrimage than a homecoming. As they packed, Elias found himself replaying memories he'd tried to forget. His mother's laugh when he'd aced a math test, his father teaching him to ride a bike. Those moments felt like another life, one where he'd been enough. Now he was someone new, someone who'd survived, who'd found love, who'd built a home with Theo. But the letter had cracked open a wound he thought had scarred over. The night before their flight, Elias lay awake beside Theo, the city's hum filtering through their window. What if they haven't changed? He whispered into the dark. Theo shifted, his arm curling around Elias's waist. Then you'll know, he said, and you'll still have me. Elias closed his eyes, holding on to those words. Whatever waited in Georgia, he wasn't the scared kid they'd left behind. He was stronger now, and he had Theo. That would have to be enough. The plane descended into Atlanta, the city sprawling beneath a haze of summer heat. Elias pressed his forehead against the window, watching the patchwork of suburbs and highways come into focus. His stomach twisted, not from the turbulence, but from the weight of what lay ahead. Theo sat beside him, sketching in a small notebook, his presence a quiet anchor. Elias hadn't said much during the flight, and Theo hadn't pushed, but their hands stayed linked, fingers intertwined like a promise. They rented a car at the airport, a beat-up sedan with a faint cigarette smell. The drive to Marietta, where his parents now lived, was an hour north, through rolling hills and neighborhoods that felt both foreign and eerily familiar. Elias's mind churned with questions. Why Georgia? Why now? Did they really want him back? Or was this just another way to control him? The letter had included an address, and as they pulled into a quiet cul-de-sac, Elias's breath caught. The house was modest, a single-story ranch with a neatly trimmed lawn and a cross hanging on the door. It looked like the kind of place his parents would choose, orderly, unassuming, steeped in faith. He parked the car, his hand shaking as he turned off the engine. You sure about this? Theo asked, his voice low. He'd swapped his usual colorful scarf for a plain gray one, a small concession to blend in, but his eyes still held that spark of defiance Elias loved. No, Elias admitted, his voice rough. But I need to do it. He stepped out, the Georgia heat wrapping around him like a heavy blanket. Theo followed, staying close but giving him space to lead. The doorbell's chime echoed inside, and Elias's heart pounded. Footsteps approached, and the door swung open to reveal his mother, Linda. She looked older, her hair grayer, her face lined with worry, but her eyes were the same, sharp and searching. "Elias," she whispered, her voice cracking. She reached out, then stopped, as if unsure he'd welcome her touch. "Mom," Elias said, the word tasting strange. Behind her, his father, Richard, appeared, his broad shoulders stooped. They stood there, a tableau of hesitation, until Linda gestured them inside. "Come in, please." The living room was sparse, with a worn couch and a coffee table stacked with religious magazines. A photo of Elias, age 10, sat on a shelf, the only trace of him in this new life. He felt Theo's hand brush his back, a reminder he wasn't alone. They sat, the silence thick, until Linda spoke. "We didn't know if you'd come. You didn't give me much choice," Elias said, sharper than he intended. He pulled the letter from his pocket, holding it like evidence. 5 years, and this is all you send?" Richard cleared his throat, his voice gravelly. "We made a mistake, son. We thought leaving was best. For all of us. Best." Elias's voice rose, years of anger bubbling up. "You left me. I was 17. I had nothing, no money, no home. You didn't even say goodbye." Linda's eyes filled with tears. "We were scared," she said. "The church, our friends, they said you were lost, that we had to let you go to save you. We believed them." Elias clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. "And now? What's changed?" Richard looked down, his hands clasped tightly. "We found a new church here. They talk about love, not judgment. It made us see things differently. We see you differently." Theo shifted beside Elias, his presence a steadying force. Elias wanted to scream, to demand why it took 5 years to see him as their son again. But he also saw the pain in their faces, the weight of their own regret. It didn't erase what they'd done, but it complicated the anger he'd carried for so long. Linda reached for a photo album on the table, her hands trembling. "We kept these," she said, opening it to reveal pictures of Elias. Birthdays, school plays, moments he thought they'd forgotten. "We never stopped loving you, even when we didn't know how to show it." Elias's throat tightened. He wanted to believe her, but trust was a fragile thing, broken by years of silence. Theo's hand found his under the table, a silent reminder of the life he'd built without them. "I need time," Elias said finally. "I can't just forget." "We don't expect you to," Richard said, his voice softer than Elias remembered. "We just want a chance to try again." That night, Elias and Theo checked into a motel nearby. Elias lay on the stiff bed, staring at the ceiling, the day's events replaying in his mind. Theo sat beside him, sketching the view from their window, a neon sign flickering against the night. "What do you think?" Theo asked, not looking up. "I don't know," Elias said. "They sound sorry, but it's not enough. Not yet." He turned to Theo, his voice barely a whisper. "What if I can't forgive them?" "Then you don't," Theo said simply. "But you're here. That's more than they deserve." Elias reached for Theo's hand, grounding himself in the warmth of his touch. Tomorrow, they'd see his parents again. He didn't know what he'd say, but for the first time, he felt like he had a choice, to stay, to leave, or to find a path somewhere in between. The next morning, Elias woke to the sound of Theo humming softly, already up and brewing coffee in the motel's cheat machine. The smell filled the room, a small comfort against the weight of the day ahead. Elias sat up, the letters still folded on the nightstand, its words burned into his mind. He wasn't sure what he'd hoped to find in Georgia. Closure, maybe, or answers that would make sense of the past. But seeing his parents yesterday had only stirred more questions. They met at a diner in Marietta, a place with checkered floors and vinyl booths that smelled of grease and nostalgia. Linda and Richard were already there, seated in a corner booth, their hands clasped tightly as if bracing for a storm. Elias slid in across from them, Theo at his side, his presence a quiet shield. The waitress poured coffee, oblivious to the tension, and left them to their uneasy silence. I want to know why, Elias said, cutting through the quiet. Not the church, not your friends. What you were thinking when you left me. Linda's face crumpled, but she didn't look away. We were ashamed, she admitted. Not of you, of ourselves. We thought we'd failed as parents, that we'd let you stray. The church told us to cut ties, to pray for you from a distance. We were weak. Richard nodded, his eyes fixed on his coffee mug. I thought if we left, you'd find your way back to what we thought was right. I see now how wrong we were. Elias's chest tightened. Their words were raw, honest in a way he hadn't expected. But they didn't erase the nights he'd spent sleeping in his car, or the days he'd wondered if he was worth loving at all. You didn't just leave, he said, his voice low but steady. You erased me. I was your son, and you acted like I didn't exist. Theo's knee pressed against his under the table, a subtle reminder of his strength. Linda reached for Elias's hand, but he pulled back, not ready for that yet. She nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. We know we hurt you, she said. We can't undo it, but we want to try to make it right. If you let us. Elias looked at Theo, whose eyes held a quiet encouragement. He wanted to believe them, but trust was a steep climb. What does making it right mean to you, he asked. Because I have a life now. I have Theo. I don't need you to fix me. Richard's face softened, a flicker of something like pride crossing his features. We don't want to fix you, he said. We want to know you, the real you. The conversation shifted, haltingly, to safer ground. Linda asked about Seattle, about Elias's job, his life. He answered cautiously, mentioning the cafe where he worked, the art shows where Theo's illustrations shone. Theo chimed in, his voice warm as he described their tiny apartment, their late-night walks through Pike Place Market. Elias watched his parents listen, their faces a mix of curiosity and regret. For the first time, they seemed to see him, not as a problem, but as a person. After the diner, they walked to a nearby park, the air thick with the scent of magnolias. Elias and Theo lagged behind, letting Linda and Richard lead the way. They're trying, Theo said quietly, his hand brushing Elias's. Doesn't mean you have to forgive them today. I know, Elias said, but the words felt heavy. He wanted to hold onto his anger. It had kept him safe, given him strength when he had nothing else. But seeing his parents' vulnerability cracked that armor just a little. That evening, Linda invited them to dinner at the house. Elias hesitated, but Theo's steady gaze convinced him to say yes. The meal was simple, roast chicken, green beans, cornbread, but it felt like a gesture, an attempt to rebuild something broken. They ate in the kitchen, the same photo album from yesterday open on the counter. Linda pointed out pictures, sharing stories Elias hadn't heard in years. For a moment, it felt like the past wasn't so far away. But then Richard mentioned the church again, describing how it had opened their eyes. Elias tensed, his fork pausing midair. Is that why you wrote? He asked, his voice sharp. Because your new church told you to? Linda shook her head quickly. No, Elias. It was us. We missed you. The church just helped us see what we'd lost. Elias wasn't sure he believed her, but he let it go. After dinner, Theo helped wash dishes, charming Linda with stories of his latest art projects. Elias watched them, a strange mix of warmth and unease settling in his chest. This was what he'd wanted once, a family that accepted him. But could he trust it now? As they drove back to the motel, Theo reached for his hand. You're doing good, he said. This is a lot, and you're handling it. Elias squeezed his hand, grateful for the anchor. I don't know what I'm doing, he admitted, but I'm glad you're here. Always, Theo said, and the word felt like a vow. The third day in Georgia dawned humid and heavy, the air pressing against Elias's skin as he and Theo walked through Marietta's town square. They'd agreed to spend the morning with his parents, a tentative step toward understanding. Elias felt caught between worlds, the one he'd built with Theo and the one he'd lost 5 years ago. Every conversation with his parents chipped away at his defenses, but the hurt ran deep, a current he couldn't ignore. They met Linda and Richard at a local farmer's market, the stalls bursting with peaches, pecans, and homemade jams. Linda bought a basket of blueberries, her smile hesitant as she offered some to Elias. He accepted, the tart sweetness a small bridge between them. Richard walked beside Theo, asking about his art with a curiosity that surprised Elias. His father had never cared about creative things before, always dismissing them as impractical. Was this change real, or just a performance? As they wandered, Linda pointed out a church steeple in the distance. "That's where we go now," she said, her voice soft. "It's different from Boise. They talk about acceptance, about love without conditions." She glanced at Elias, her eyes pleading. "It's what made us realize we needed to reach out." Elias's jaw tightened. "A church doesn't get to decide if I'm worth loving," he said. "You should have figured that out on your own." Linda flinched but nodded. "You're right. We should have." Theo steered the conversation to lighter topics, asking about the town's history, and Richard launched into a story about Marietta's old railway. Elias listened, half present, his mind wrestling with the past. He remembered the church in Boise, its pews filled with people who'd called him an abomination. His parents had sat in those pews, nodding along. Could new church really change them? They ended the morning at a cafe, sipping iced tea under a shaded patio. Elias watched his parents closely, searching for signs of the people who'd left him. They seemed softer now, their edges worn by time and regret. But he couldn't shake the fear that this was temporary, that they'd hurt him again if he let them in. After lunch, Theo suggested a drive to Kennesaw Mountain, a nearby battlefield park. The rolling hills and quiet trails felt like neutral ground, a place to breathe. Elias and Theo walked ahead, their hands brushing as they climbed a gentle slope. Linda and Richard followed, their voices a low murmur behind them. At the summit, the view stretched across the Georgia countryside, green and endless under a wide sky. "This place feels like it's seen a lot," Theo said, his eyes on the horizon. "Makes your problems feel small, doesn't it?" Elias nodded, but his problems didn't feel small. They felt like a weight he'd carried for years, one he wasn't sure he could set down. He glanced at his parents, who stood a few feet away, looking out at the view. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted to Theo, his voice low. "I want to believe them, but I'm scared." Theo turned to him, his expression fierce. "You don't have to decide now. You're allowed to take your time, Elias. You're allowed to protect yourself." Elias's eyes stung, and he looked away, focusing on the distant trees. Theo's words were a lifeline, reminding him he had control, that he wasn't the kid who'd been left behind. He reached for Theo's hand, holding it tightly, and for a moment, the world felt steady. That evening, back at the house, Linda pulled Elias aside. "I know we don't deserve your trust," she said, her voice trembling. "But we're trying. We want to meet you halfway, if you'll let us." Elias studied her, searching for the mother he'd once known. "Halfway's a long way," he said, "but I'm here. That's something." She smiled, a fragile thing, and nodded. As they rejoined Theo and Richard, Elias felt a shift, small but real. He wasn't ready to forgive, but he was ready to listen. For now, that was enough. The fourth day brought a storm, gray clouds rolling over Marietta and trapping Elias and Theo indoors with his parents. The house felt smaller in the rain, its walls closing in as they sat in the living room, a board game spread out on the coffee table. It was Linda's idea, an attempt at normalcy, but every move felt like a test. Elias rolled the dice, his mind elsewhere, replaying the conversations of the past few days. Theo, ever the peacemaker, kept the mood light, joking about his terrible luck at Monopoly. Richard laughed, a sound Elias hadn't heard in years, and even Linda seemed to relax, her shoulders loosening as she passed the dice. But Elias couldn't shake the tension coiled in his chest. Every smile, every story, felt like a step towards something he wasn't sure he wanted. During a break, Elias wandered to the kitchen, needing space. Richard followed, his footsteps heavy on the hardwood. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice low. Elias nodded, bracing himself. "I know I wasn't the father you needed," Richard said, leaning against the counter. "I was raised to believe certain things, And when you told us, I didn't know how to handle it. I thought leaving would protect you, give you a chance to change. I was wrong. Elias's throat tightened. You thought I needed to change? He asked, his voice sharp. I was your kid. I needed you to love me, not fix me. Richard's face crumpled, and for the first time, Elias saw him as a man, not just a father, a man who'd made mistakes, who carried his own regrets. I know that now, Richard said. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need you to know I'm sorry. For all of it. Elias didn't respond, the words too raw to process. He returned to the living room, where Theo and Linda were laughing over a bad roll. Theo caught his eye, his smile fading as he read Elias's expression. He excused himself and joined Elias in the hallway. You okay? He asked, his voice soft. I don't know, Elias said, his voice breaking. He's sorry, but it doesn't change what they did. It doesn't fix the years I lost. Theo pulled him into a hug, his arms a safe harbor. It doesn't have to fix it, he said, but it's a start. You get to decide what comes next. That night, as the rain pounded the roof, Elias and Theo lay in the motel bed, talking in whispers. Elias admitted how torn he felt, wanting to reconnect, but afraid of being hurt again. Theo listened, his hand tracing circles on Elias's back. You're stronger than you think, Theo said. You've built a life without them. Whatever you choose, you're not alone. The next morning, the storm had cleared, and they met Linda and Richard for breakfast at a pancake house. The conversation was lighter, focused on small things. Theo's latest painting, Linda's gardening hobby. Elias watched his parents, seeing them not as the people who'd left, but as people trying to find their way back. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a step. As they left the restaurant, Linda hugged Elias, her embrace tentative but warm. Thank you for coming, she said. It means more than you know. Elias nodded, his heart heavy but lighter than it had been. He wasn't ready to call this home, but he was starting to see a path forward, one where he could choose what family meant and who got to be part of it. The fifth day in Georgia felt different, like the air had shifted. Elias woke with a clarity he hadn't felt before, a sense that he was here not just to confront the past, but to define his future. He and Theo met his parents at a local community center, where Linda volunteered. The center was vibrant, filled with kids painting murals and elderly folks playing chess. It was a far cry from the rigid church of Elias's childhood, and he couldn't help but notice the pride in Linda's eyes as she showed them around. They spent the morning helping with an art project, Theo guiding kids through watercolor techniques while Elias and his parents sorted supplies. Richard's hands were steady as he organized paintbrushes, but his eyes kept drifting to Elias, as if memorizing him. You're good with this, Richard said, gesturing to the chaos of the art room. You always were creative. Elias paused, surprised. You never seemed to notice, he said, not accusingly, but honestly. Richard's face fell. I noticed, he said quietly. I just didn't know how to say it. The moment hung between them, fragile but real. Elias didn't know how to respond, so he nodded, focusing on the task at hand. But the words stayed with him, a crack in the wall he'd built around his heart. Later, they sat in the center's garden, eating sandwiches under a sprawling oak. Linda shared stories of her volunteer work, her voice warm with purpose. Elias listened, seeing a side of her he'd never known, a woman who cared about her community, who was trying to make amends in her own way. He wondered if this was who she'd always been, hidden beneath the fear and judgment of their old life. Theo, ever observant, nudged Elias's shoulder. You're quiet, he said, low enough for only Elias to hear. What's going on in that head of yours? Elias smiled faintly. Just thinking about what family means, he said, if it's blood or choice or both. Theo's eyes softened. It's what you make it, he said, and you've got me, no matter what. That afternoon, they drove to a nearby lake, the water glinting under the sun. Elias and Theo walked along the shore, while Linda and Richard stayed back, giving them space. Elias kicked a pebble into the water, watching the ripples spread. I think I want to try, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Not for them, but for me, to see if there's something worth salvaging. Theo nodded, his hand finding Elias's. Then we'll try together. That evening, back at the house, Elias sat down with his parents for a real conversation. He told them about his life in Seattle. Not just the surface details, but the struggles, the triumphs, the love he'd found with Theo. They listened, really listened, and for the first time, Elias felt seen. Not as the son they'd lost, but as the man he'd become. Linda reached for his hand, and this time he didn't pull away. "We want to be part of your life," she said. "However you'll have us." Elias didn't have an answer yet, but he felt the weight of possibility. Maybe family wasn't about erasing the past, but about building something new from its ashes. On the final day, Elias stood in his parents' backyard, the Georgia sun warm on his face. Theo was beside him, sketching the garden, his pencil capturing the wildflowers Linda had planted. Elias felt a quiet resolve settling in his chest. This trip hadn't erased the pain, but it had given him something he hadn't expected: hope. They spent the morning packing, their flight back to Seattle scheduled for that evening. Linda and Richard insisted on driving them to the airport, and the car ride was filled with a tentative ease. They talked about small things, recipes, music, plans for a visit to Seattle. Elias realized he was starting to imagine a future where his parents were part of his life, not as they'd been, but as they were trying to be. At the airport, Linda hugged him tightly, her tears damp against his shoulder. "Thank you for giving us a chance," she whispered. Richard shook his hand, then pulled him into an embrace, his grip strong but careful. "We're proud of you," he said, his voice thick. "We always were." Elias nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He didn't know if he'd ever fully forgive them, but he was willing to try. That was enough for now. As he and Theo boarded the plane, Elias felt lighter, like he'd left some of his anger behind in Georgia. Theo reached for his hand, their fingers lacing together. "You did good," Theo said, his smile warm. "You faced it, and you're still you." Elias leaned against him, watching the clouds through the window as the plane took off. "I'm more than I was," he said. "Because of you." Back in Seattle, life resumed its rhythm. Coffee shifts, art shows, late-night talks in their cluttered apartment. But something had shifted. Elias kept the letter on his desk, not as a wound, but as a reminder of what he'd overcome. He started texting his parents, small updates at first, then longer calls. They sent care packages, blueberries, a scarf for Theo, a photo of Elias they'd framed. Months later, Linda and Richard visited Seattle. They stayed in a hotel, respecting Elias's space, and joined him and Theo for dinner at their favorite cafe. The conversation flowed, not without awkward moments, but with a warmth that felt new. Elias watched Theo laugh with his parents, and for the first time, he saw a family taking shape, one built on choice, not obligation. The past would always be there, a scar that ached sometimes. But Elias had learned that love wasn't about perfection. It was about showing up, even when it hurt. He'd shown up in Georgia, and his parents were showing up now. That was the start of something real. As they walked home that night, Theo's hand in his, Elias looked up at the Seattle sky, stars faint against the city lights. He didn't have all the answers, but he had this, a life he'd chosen, a love that held him steady, and a family he was learning to trust again. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough.